45 years ago, a young schoolteacher named Helen Marie Driscoll disappeared from the town of Harwick, Ohio, leaving behind her station wagon idling in the parking lot of the A&P Grocery on Maple Street, a paper bag of groceries on the passenger seat, and a gallon of milk that had gone warm by the time the first deputy arrived. Authorities at the time concluded that Helen had left voluntarily, that she had, in the language of the original case file, departed the area of her own choosing, and could not be considered a missing person under the statutes then in effect. Her father, a man named Earl Driscoll, who had spent 32 years working the line at the Harwick glass plant, refused this conclusion with the patient, immovable certainty of a man who understood that some things are simply not true regardless of what is written in a document. He spent the rest of his life believing his daughter had not left willingly. He died in 2017 without an answer. But he left something behind. A letter, sealed, addressed to the Portage County Sheriff's Office, with a note on the envelope in his careful handwriting, "Open if anything ever changes." In February of 2020, something changed, and everything Earl Driscoll had known about his daughter's disappearance turned out to be exactly right. But before we get to that letter, we have to go back to 1979. Because to understand what Earl Driscoll knew, you first have to understand who Helen Marie Driscoll was and what she had figured out in the weeks before she vanished. Harwick, Ohio, in the spring of 1979, was a town that ran on the rhythms of manufacturing and church calendars, a place where the shift whistle at the glass plant set the time for half the households in the county, and where the high school football coach had more authority than the mayor, and everyone understood this as the natural order of things. The town sat in the rolling hills of Portage County, surrounded by dairy farms and apple orchards that came into white bloom every April, like a quiet annual argument for staying. Population 4,200. One main street with a hardware store, a dime store, a barber shop, a diner called Vera's, where the booths had red vinyl seats that had been repaired with electrical tape so many times the tape had become part of the decor. People left their doors unlocked. Children walked to school. Neighbors borrowed tools without asking and returned them without mentioning it. It was the kind of town that appeared, from the outside and from the inside, to take care of its own. Helen Marie Driscoll was 26 years old that spring, in her third year teaching second grade at Harwick Elementary School. She had studied education at Kent State, graduated in 1975, and come home to Harwick because her mother was ill, and her father was alone with that illness, and she was not the kind of person who left people alone with hard things. Her students called her Miss Driscoll and drew pictures of her with yellow hair, which was accurate, and oversized shoes, which she found hilarious. She kept the drawings in a folder on her desk. She graded papers on Saturday mornings at Vera's. Always the same booth by the window, always with the same cup of tea, and the owner, Vera Kaminsky herself, would bring the tea without being asked. Because Helen had been coming in that booth on Saturday mornings since she was 12 years old, and some things in a small town become sacred through repetition alone. Her father, Earl, was 61 that year, still on the line at the glass plant, a quiet man who expressed love through repair, fixing the storm window that stuck, rotating the tires on her station wagon, leaving bags of vegetables from his garden on her porch without knocking. Her mother, Pauline, had died the previous November. Helen and Earl were managing their grief the way people of that generation managed most hard things, by staying busy and staying close to each other. Helen had recently been troubled by something. Her friend and fellow teacher, Norma Schultz, would later tell investigators that in the weeks before her disappearance, Helen had seemed distracted, not afraid, exactly, but carrying something she hadn't set down yet. Helen had told Norma she had come across something at school that didn't sit right. She hadn't said more than that. Norma hadn't pushed. On the morning of April 3rd, 1979, Helen drove to school, taught her class, and told the school secretary on her way out that afternoon that she needed to stop at the A&P before heading to her father's house for dinner. Earl had pot roast in the slow cooker. He was expecting her at 6. She never arrived. The A&P on Maple Street closed at 9 p.m. on weekday evenings, and it was the evening manager, a man named Terry Boggs, who noticed the station wagon still in the lot at 8:45 p.m. A 1974 Ford Country Squire with the wood panel siding tan, which he recognized as belonging to the school teacher because she came in every Thursday. The driver's door was unlocked. The key was in the ignition. The engine had run until it had not, and the paper bag on the passenger seat contained a box of cornflakes, a can of tomato soup, 2 oranges, and 1 gallon of whole milk that was, by then, no longer cold. Boggs called the Portage County Sheriff's Office at 8:51 p.m. A deputy arrived at 9:09 p.m. and noted the scene without treating it as a crime scene. The grocery bag was photographed. The key was left in the ignition. The car was not processed for fingerprints until 3 days later, by which time it had been touched by 4 deputies, the evening manager, and a tow truck operator. Earl Driscoll arrived at the A&P at 9:22 p.m. after calling the sheriff's office himself when Helen had not appeared for dinner. He stood in the parking lot in the cold April air and looked at his daughter's car and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked the deputy standing beside him, "Where is she?" The deputy said they didn't know yet. Earl never stopped asking that question. By April 5th, the Portage County Sheriff's Office had formally classified the case as a voluntary disappearance. No sign of struggle. No evidence of foul play. The assumption, recorded in the case file by Detective Harold Beam, who had 30 years on the job and had seen young women leave difficult situations before, was that Helen Driscoll had arranged a departure and executed it cleanly. The grocery bag and idling engine were considered consistent with a staged exit. He was not a careless man. He was, in the specific way that institutions sometimes fail people, a man who had seen a pattern enough times that he stopped looking for the exception. Helen's classroom was not searched. Her school desk was not examined. Whatever she had told Norma Schultz she had come across, the thing that didn't sit right, was never identified, never documented, never followed. That oversight would matter enormously, 41 years later. Earl Driscoll, meanwhile, spent the spring of 1979 doing what investigators would not. He drove the roads between the school and the A&P. He talked to every person who might have seen his daughter between 3:30 and 8:45 p.m. on April 3rd. He found a woman named Dottie Ferris who lived 2 blocks from the grocery and who had seen Helen's station wagon parked in the lot earlier than anyone had noted, around 5:15 p.m., with a second vehicle parked alongside it, close, a dark truck. She had not thought anything of it at the time. Earl brought this to Detective Beam. Beam noted it in the file. He did not canvass for the truck. The institutional failure was not malice. It was the particular blindness that comes from a conclusion reached too early. The years between 1979 and Earl Driscoll's death in 2017 were not empty years. They were years full of the specific weight that comes from a loss that has no bottom and no name. A disappearance without a body, without a verdict, without a story that ends. By 1985, 6 years had passed. Helen's classroom had been repainted and assigned to another teacher. The A&P had been sold, converted into a dollar store, and then into a vacant lot. Her station wagon sat in Earl's driveway for 4 years before he finally let a neighbor take it for parts. and he stood in the driveway afterward and looked at the empty space for a while before going inside. By 1995, the case had not been formally reviewed in 9 years. Earl was 77 years old and still driving past the vacant lot on Maple Street on his way to the diner where he had coffee every morning. A different diner now. Vera's had closed in 1988 when Vera's knees finally gave out. But Earl went to the new place because the habit of the route was something he had not been willing to surrender. He sent a letter to the Portage County Sheriff's Office every year on April 3rd, the anniversary of Helen's disappearance, asking whether the file had been reopened. Each year he received a form letter in response. By 2005, 26 years had passed. Helen would have been 52. Earl kept a school photograph of her on his kitchen table, the one from her first year teaching, 1975, the year she came home. He would not move it. The Portage County Library had, by 2006, digitized its local newspaper archive going back to 1952. Helen Driscoll's disappearance had been covered in the Harwick Courier in April and May of 1979, and those articles were now searchable. They were found, occasionally, by people researching local history or cold cases. None of those people had access to the case file. None of them had what Earl Driscoll had been accumulating for decades: names, dates. The note about the dark truck. The thing Helen had told Norma about something that didn't sit right. Earl wrote it all down in the letter. He sealed it in 2014, when he was 95 years old and could feel himself running out of time. He addressed it to the sheriff's office and wrote on the envelope, in his careful handwriting, 4 words that would matter more than he knew. He died on a Tuesday in March of 2017. His neighbor found the letter on the kitchen table and delivered it as instructed. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Helen. The letter sat in an administrative file at the Portage County Sheriff's Office for 3 years. Then, in January of 2020, a newly assigned cold case investigator named Detective Sandra Okafor began a systematic review of long dormant cases flagged for potential DINA review under Ohio's 2018 cold case statute. Helen Driscoll's file came across her desk on a Wednesday in February. She opened the administrative file first. Earl Driscoll's letter was on top. Detective Sandra Okafor read Earl Driscoll's letter twice in her office that Wednesday morning, then a third time with a highlighter. The letter was 11 pages, handwritten in the same careful script as the envelope. It documented, in chronological order, every piece of information Earl had gathered across 38 years of private investigation. The name, Dottie Ferris. The dark truck parked alongside Helen's station wagon at 5:15 p.m. The specific thing Helen had confided to Norma Schultz about something at school that didn't sit right, and, most critically, Earl's own conclusion about who had been driving that truck. He had spent years arriving at a name. He had never been able to prove it. But he had written it down. The name was Raymond Holst. In 1979, Holst had been the assistant principal at Harwick Elementary School. He had retired in 1991, moved to a property outside of Ravenna, and died of a heart attack in 2009. He had been, in the community's memory, an unremarkable man, strict with the students, formal with the staff, the kind of administrator who ran a tight building and was respected without being particularly liked. He had driven, in 1979, a dark Ford pickup truck. Okafor pulled the original case file, which had not been substantively reviewed since 1986. She found the notation about the dark truck, which Beam had recorded and not pursued. She found the notation about Helen's comment to Norma Schultz, which Beam had recorded and not pursued. And she found something else. A single item documented in the evidence log and stored in the county evidence facility since 1979. A woman's wool scarf, dark green, found in the parking lot of the A&P on the night of April 3rd. Recovered by a deputy and bagged without ceremony, and stored without anyone connecting it to Helen Driscoll. Because Helen's coat had been a tan color and her scarf had not been documented in the missing persons report at all. The scarf had been in storage for 41 years. Okafor submitted it for DNA analysis under the Ohio Cold Case Protocol. The process works by extracting cellular material from fabric fibers and comparing recovered DNA profiles against the state's law enforcement database as well as the national CODIS system. 3 weeks later, the lab returned a result. The scarf carried 2 DNA profiles, one consistent with Helen Driscoll, confirmed against a reference sample from a surviving maternal cousin, and one from an unknown male contributor. That male profile was entered into CODIS. It matched a sample collected from Raymond Holst in 2007 during a routine health screening at the Portage County Jail, where he had been briefly held on an unrelated matter that was subsequently dismissed. The sample had been collected and entered into the database as a matter of standard procedure. It had been sitting there for 13 years, waiting for the right question. Okafor set down the report. She looked at Earl Driscoll's letter on her desk. The man had known. He had not had the tools. He had left her the map. Raymond Holst had died in 2009. He would never face arrest. He would never sit in a courtroom. He would never look at Helen Driscoll's father across a room and have to account for what he had done. That is the particular grief of a cold case solved after the person responsible has died. The justice is real, but it arrives in a shape that no family entirely expected, and no family entirely welcomes. What investigators were able to reconstruct through the DNA evidence, Dottie Ferris's account of the parked vehicles, and a subsequent review of the school's records from 1979, told a story of a man who had used his position of authority to conceal something, and who had, when that concealment was threatened, acted to protect himself. The school records review, conducted by Okafor with the cooperation of the Harwick School District, found a disciplinary complaint filed by Helen Driscoll in the final week of March 1979, 1 week before her disappearance, alleging financial irregularities in the school's parent fund accounts. The complaint had been filed with Holst himself as the building administrator. It had not been forwarded. It had been buried. Helen had, in the weeks before she died, found something that pointed at the man she was required to report to. She had reported it anyway. That was the kind of woman she was. Court documents filed in connection with the official resolution of the case in 2020 confirmed that the Portage County Prosecutor's Office formally recognized Helen Marie Driscoll's death as a homicide, with Raymond Holst identified as the responsible party. On the basis of the NA match, the physical evidence, and the circumstantial record, a posthumous finding of this nature carries no criminal sentence. There is no one left to sentence, but it carries legal weight. It changes the record. It changes what is officially true. Helen Driscoll's case was closed as solved on September 14, 2020. She had been missing for 41 years and 5 months. Her surviving cousin, a woman named Carol Haynes, who had been 11 years old when Helen disappeared, and who had grown up in the next county over, gave a statement to the Portage County Prosecutor's Office. She said, "Helen went to that school every day and tried to do the right thing. She found something wrong, and she reported it. That was the last thing she ever did. I think she would want people to know that the last thing she did was the right thing. That statement is, in the whole documented record of this case, the most accurate thing anyone ever said about Helen Marie Driscoll. Helen Marie Driscoll was 26 years old on the morning of April 3, 1979, when she drove to school and taught her second graders and stopped at the A&P on the way to her father's house for pot roast. She kept her students' drawings in a folder on her desk. She graded papers on Saturday mornings in the same booth by the same window where she had sat since she was 12. She came home from college to take care of her father when her mother was sick because she did not leave people alone with hard things. She found something wrong at her school, and she reported it, the way you are supposed to the person responsible, not knowing that the person responsible was the problem. Earl Driscoll spent 38 years writing down everything he knew. He sealed it in an envelope and left instructions for a world he would not live to see. He trusted that eventually someone would ask the right question. He was right. He was right about all of it. The green wool scarf recovered from the A&P parking lot on April 3, 1979, entered into evidence by a deputy who had no idea what he was preserving, spent 41 years in a storage facility waiting for a technology that did not yet exist when Helen Driscoll disappeared. The cellular biology that makes DNA profiling possible was still a decade away from practical application in 1979. Nobody in that parking lot on that cold April night could have known what the scarf contained, or what it would eventually say. What does it mean that the evidence to solve this case existed in 1979 and simply had to wait for the science to catch up to it? How many other cases are sitting in evidence facilities right now, carrying answers that we do not yet have the tools to hear? And do you believe that Earl Driscoll, who spent 38 years writing down what he knew and left it in a sealed envelope for whoever came next, do you believe he knew, somehow, that it would be enough? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These questions deserve the kind of discussion that only happens in places like this. Justice found Helen Marie Driscoll after 41 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.